been ignored by the media. Gee, I wonder why. But at least these two reporters shared the truth on that. Watch this.
So the European Union has not really worked out well for Europe. We'll know the details this winter when people are freezing. So naturally, the Biden administration wants to create something very much like that in North America, an EU-style government. The Mexican president, AMLO, says that Tony Blinken, our Secretary of State, just proposed that idea. Watch this.
I think that Mr. Blinken spoke about consolidating the region of North America, and we agree on that. We are also in favor of a unity of the entire American continent, like the way the first European community emerged and converted into the European Union. That's what we want.
Oh, so we're going to merge with Mexico in the middle of the most brutal drug war in its history. Mexico is effectively run by the cartels at this point, but we're going to merge with the cartels. Okay. No one noticed this, really. Florida Congressman Matt Gaetz noticed it. He sent a letter today to Tony Blinken asking, what is this? He joins us tonight to tell us what he's heard back. Congressman, thanks so much for noticing this and for asking what it means. What does it mean, and did you get an answer?
It means that the globalist left wants a homogenized North America because they don't think that much of the United States of America in the first place. I haven't gotten an answer, but it begs the question, why are we so friendly with Mexico anyway? They've cooked up more death in the Mexican mountains than any crazy mad scientist in Wuhan would have ever thought of. And it's hard to tell where the cartels end and the government of Mexico begins. They had a former president take a $100 million bribe from Sinaloa. They had a former defense chief function as the muscle for the cartel, one of their state-level attorneys general sentenced to 20 years in the United States of America. But while they're sleepwalking to a war with Russia, they are actually surrendering American sovereignty to Mexico, and Canada's not much better. I don't want my constituents having to live under the socialist tyrannical lockdowns enacted by Justin Trudeau Castro while their nephew's being poisoned by Mexican fentanyl, but that apparently is the globalist order that the Biden administration supports here as they give away our money and our chance of a brighter future overseas.
But what am I talking about? I'm talking about the fact that the vast majority of Americans are not aware that the cartels in Mexico have transformed into the most powerful transnational criminal organizations on earth. And that whereas before they used to let traffickers handle the flow of human traffic because it wasn't worth that much for them, that has changed completely. And what you are seeing today is that human beings are worth as much to the Mexican cartels as narcotics and all these other things. And what does that actually translate to in practical terms? It means that the U.S. Marshals, when they do a bust in South Texas, they find that women, some of whom are 8 months pregnant, are being taken to a back room at a gas station and being raped every day for money to pay off their debt to the cartels. It means that when you're one of those people in New York City that says, look at these immigrants, aren't they good, hardworking people because it's your favorite fancy restaurant? They're in the kitchen washing the dishes and they're bussing tables and they're doing this. Well, guess what? They're doing 2-3 jobs, and most of that money is going to the cartel. It's not going to them. And why does this matter? Well, because we have in place an administration filled with open border ideologues who are implementing a globalist policy that no one was given the option in this country to vote on, that bypasses the legislature and is completely in violation of the Constitution. And what they're edging towards, and I know this from a source who was in meetings at the UN behind closed doors, these are classified meetings, and listen to these discussions of infiltrating 100 million people into the United States as the basis for forming a regional government instead of a national government. So a government of Canada, Mexico, and the US. This is the strategy that's in place. And so things like the cartels were created as part of a push-pull strategy where they would push people out of those countries because life would become unbearable and pull them into the United States. It's about the destruction of this country. And it's put in place step by step so that you don't really know what's happening.
Wow.
Wow is right, okay? And here's Biden even more recently tweeting out that he's, quote, meeting with President Andres Manuel Lopez Obrador of Mexico and Prime Minister Justin Trudeau of Canada at the what? the North American Leaders Summit. This gathering will deepen our coordination, listen, and advance our shared priorities for North America. Yeah, a new one called North American Union. In fact, notice how they once again have simply changed the name. It used to be called SPP, or Security and Prosperity Partnership, but now it's called the North American Leaders Summit, or NALS, okay? Or sometimes it's called the Three Amigos Summit, which is apparently the more popular term in the press uses, just to make sure that, we stay confused and don't catch on, okay? But speaking of catching on, look at that picture again and notice the map on the right of this North American Leaders Summit. It clearly highlights their intentions, folks. They are meeting to what? To discuss the combining of all three countries there in green, Canada, US, and Mexico. It's right there. And it's nuts. It's all being done, folks, right before our very eyes, and we're all distracted or whatever. And that's why, folks, this article is brainwashing people with this rationale. Quote, the United States global power is fading fast. Yeah, because Joe Biden and the other World Economic Forum puppets working for Klaus Schwab and our government are doing it on purpose, they're destroying it. But it goes on to say this, and I quote, with its own global power fading fast, the United States will undoubtedly become a far more regional power. While some Washington insiders might see this trend as at best a retreat or at worst a defeat, it's actually an opportunity to fundamentally reconsider relations of our home region, North America. To resolve its growing problems, the whole North America could clearly benefit from a parallel union. In many ways, the task should be easier than Europe's. While the EU has 13 official languages, a North American union would only need 3, English, French, and Spanish, fewer than tiny Switzerland. With such economic fundamentals in place, in other words, once they destroy our economy, those countries could then move towards a European Union-style shared governance, so as to better navigate the growing climate crisis and its threat to a demographic disaster through genuine regional collaboration, as well as a redefinition of, defense, as in Defense Department, as greater protection from onrushing natural disasters. Washington, could become the epicenter of a multinational union by taking the necessary steps beyond CAFTA and NAFTA and NORAD. Washington could help lead its North American neighbors, roiled by the ravages of climate change, to a more perfect union. In the process, this entire hemisphere would ultimately become a far safer haven for its share of humanity and the troubled decades to come. This is total insanity and total denial of our national sovereignty, and frankly, it's total treasonous behavior. But this is the reality. Folks, we have been duped. We've been duped for a long time by these global elite megalomaniacs, including Klaus Schwab, the World Economic Forum, who are deliberately destroying America to create their tin-horn economic kingdom for planetary control, who would then at some point, as the Bible declares, hand that all over to the actual Antichrist. It's wild. It's almost like we're living the last days, and if you're not saved, you better ask Jesus Christ right now to forgive you of your sins and get saved right now. This is not a game. And that's why this article shares this, quote, defeat the Great Reset to save America's freedoms. Quote, the Great Reset is truly a serious threat to American freedoms, especially the freedoms of speech, religion, and assembly. This is also a serious threat to America's unique constitutional republic. Thus, every freedom-loving American needs to fight against this so-called reset with tooth and nail. Alarmingly, over 80% of large American companies have already become a part of the Great Reset in one way or another. Ultimately, proponents of the Great Reset plan to control people's behavior by means of advanced technology, artificial intelligence again, and a worldwide digital currency where a leftist government or bank could easily strip a person of all means to purchase goods, pay bills, etc., due to their unacceptable behavior. Further, Great Reset supporters have established a communist Chinese-like social credit scoring system where organizations and individuals are given a social credit score, rewarding those who have a high rating and punishing those who have low scores. Here's 3 examples of how the Great Reset ultimately could affect the lives of even ordinary Americans. Number 1, here's the scenario. A man owns a trucking business and he makes public statements opposing the leftist climate change agenda, to completely rid America of fossil fuels by, again, 2030. Well, he did that, but when he applies for a loan to expand his business, his bank and other banks refuse to loan him any money because of his unacceptable statements about climate change agenda. In order to get the loan, listen, he's required to go along with the climate change agenda and refute his previous statements opposing the agenda, which obviously is what? That's a violation of the freedom of speech. Number two, here's the scenario. This is what's coming. A woman belongs to a parents group that opposes the teaching of critical race theory at her child's school, and she worships at a church where the pastor preaches against homosexuality. She receives a notice from her bank that her account is no longer welcome at that bank, or her application for a loan has been disapproved due to her unacceptable participation in the above activities. She can receive funds if she leaves the parents group and her church, which is what? A violation of the woman's freedom of assembly and religion. Number three, here's another scenario. This is what they want. A conservative political candidate speaks against the transgender and LGBTQ movements. He receives a notice, though, from his bank and other banks that his campaign funds are frozen due to his unacceptable statements about the above movements, again, a violation of a person's freedom of speech. And he says this, Americans need to know that as a part of the Great Reset, the World Economic Forum has developed an environmental, social, and governance ESG index, social credit index like China, by which an individual or organization is rated to determine their wokeness and how in tune they are with the leftist radical agenda. If rated low, banks could refuse loans and or close your account for a non-woke individual organization. According to the Great Reset, this index is now used by thousands, did you catch that? Now used by thousands of companies in more than 50 countries, including many countries in the United States. Americans must pull together and fight and defeat this insidious effort, an effort by many of the world's elites to, quote, gain control and power over the nations and peoples of the world. And you wonder why we're doing this documentary. But as you can see, this plan for a communist worldwide planetary takeover that's simply relabeled as the Great Reset or Agenda 21 or Agenda 2030 or even the Fourth Industrial Revolution is starting to become so obvious, folks, for those that got, again, eyes to see and ears to hear, that others besides us are starting to blow the whistle on it as well.
This is the plan that I have repeatedly warned about, to take the tools of oppression used to tackle the coronavirus and use them all, lockdowns, forced business closures, exclusion zones, isolation. We heard Angela Marsden earlier, businesses shut down, isolation at home, all of that, all of those measures, including destroying private property rights and private income in order to tackle the climate crisis.
Now is a historical moment, a time, not only to fight severe virus, but to shape the system.
We have a unique but rapidly shrinking window of opportunity to learn lessons and reset ourselves on a more sustainable path. It is an opportunity we have never had before and may never have again. So we must use all the levers we have at our disposal, knowing that each and every one of us has a vital role to play.
The Great Reset is a welcome recognition that this human tragedy must be a wake-up call. It is imperative that we reimagine, rebuild, redesign, reinvigorate, and rebalance our world. Rebalancing investment, harnessing science and technology, and advancing the transition to net zero emissions, all elements of the Great Reset, are fundamental to building the future we need.
And that last one was the clown Guterres, who was at the Climate Ambition Summit, telling us the world is going to cook by 3.5 degrees or something by the end of the century. Yeah, right. This Great Reset is as serious and as dangerous a threat to our prosperity, to your prosperity and your freedom, as we have faced in decades, with these powerful bodies, including the World Economic Forum, the United Nations, the International Monetary Fund, and even Prince Charles boasting, yes, boasting that within a few short years, yes, their words, you will own nothing and you will be happy. Remember, this is not me saying this, this is them. They are even running ads for the Great Reset. handful of countries will dominate. I wonder which ones they might be. A terrifying coalition of big business, big tech, and left-wing totalitarians are so confident and so brazen. I mean, they just stole the US election, so I guess they're feeling pretty chuffed with themselves, that they are now promising you will own nothing and you will be happy. What they should have added is, and we, the very rich, will own everything and be even happier. Of course they will. The great tragedy here is that Prince Charles is involved in this fascist, corporatist global push and is thereby putting our entire constitutional monarchy at risk. And you think I'm just imagining this stuff? Crazy old Rowan with his conspiracy theories? Think again. This garbage is already deeply embedded into our state and federal governments. I've spoken before about the insidious phrase, build back better, which sounds like common sense, but is in fact just one of several slogans for the Great Reset. Another being the Orwellian phrase, the Fourth Industrial Revolution. Here's old Klaus again, minus the white cat on his knee, telling us all about the Fourth Industrial Revolution.
The Fourth Industrial Revolution will impact our lives completely. It will not only change how we communicate, how we produce, how we consume, it will change actually us, our own identity, and of course gives life to such policies and developments like smart traffic, smart government, smart cities. What we will see is that everything will be integrated into an ecosystem driven by big data and driven particularly by close cooperation also of governments with business, civil society. And this revolution will come at a breathtaking speed. It will be like a tsunami.
Like a tsunami in the Fourth Industrial Revolution, you will own nothing, but you will be happy. That is an order. It gets worse. The World Economic Forum are now blatantly saying capitalism needs a dose of Marxism. As I say, it's not like they're hiding their sinister intentions. Indeed, I was horrified when an outsider fan last week sent me this document from the Australian government. Quote, preparing for the future. Industry 4.0 test labs in Australia, a strategic initiative of the Prime Minister's Industry 4.0 Task Force. Section 1, Significance of the Fourth Industrial Revolution. Unbelievable. Australia rejects the reset.
It's at the end, what the Fourth Industrial Revolution will lead to is a fusion of our physical, our digital, and our biological identities.
No, mate, not in Australia it won't. Rack off, Klaus.
Well, now, look, a week ago I spoke to you about what I said you wouldn't hear anywhere else, but you would hear on this program, because in other media, there are certain things you are not allowed to say. You're not allowed to differ from the so-called wisdom of the experts. I mentioned this outfit called the World Economic Forum. There's been a tremendous response online to what I had to say. I mentioned that the mission statement of this World Economic Forum says it is committed to, and I quote, improving the state of the world by engaging business, political, academic and other leaders of society to shape global, regional and industrial agendas, unquote. I mentioned the founder, this German economist Klaus Schwab, who said in 2020, and I quote, the pandemic represents a rare but narrow opportunity to reflect, reimagine, here's the key word, and reset our world. All aspects of our societies and economies must be revamped, he said, from education to social contracts and working conditions, unquote. The key words, reset our world. Is that happening in our classroom and universities and what is being taught? One first-year university student told me recently he had to write an assignment on the impact of climate change on gender. Reset our world. We had it in coronavirus. The total denial of freedom and the usurping of those freedoms by unelected bureaucrats and big government. I reminded you of the other odious individual, the late Maurice Strong, the godfather of climate change, who said in 1992, we may get to the point where the only way of saving the world will be for industrialised civilization to collapse. Isn't it our responsibility to bring this about, unquote? And Schwab, the founder of this World Economic Forum, said, we need a great reset of capitalism. When this mob, the World Economic Forum, were challenged 2 years ago to debate this question of climate emergency, they declined. Of course they would. Remember, the founder, Klaus Schwab, means what he says, that all aspects of our societies and our economies must be revamped. Well, what's the easiest way to do that? Ignore and cancel anyone who disagrees. Even when those who disagree are prepared to engage in climate debate, as the Friends of Science said, quote, with the sound and ancient principle that all pertinent parties should be fully heard, unquote. Well, this nonsense at the World Economic Forum goes on. Russian oligarchs and US billionaires flying in on private jets, banging on about global emissions and income inequality, African dictators screaming about climate change and the need for immediate compensation from the West, and the journalists and commentators just swallow this stuff. As Professor Judith Sloan, to whom I spoke last week, recently wrote, quote, they churn out puerile pieces about the wonderful reform, reset initiatives being discussed by the hand-picked elites headed by the indestructible Klaus Schwab. Well, in 2021, a special address to this mob was delivered by Vladimir Putin. But who was the opening keynote speaker at this year's Davos conference? The freedom-loving dictator, President Xi of China. And amongst other things, he said, quote, economic globalisation is the trend of the times. Though the countercurrents are sure to exist in a river, none can stop the river from flowing to the sea. Despite the countercurrents and dangerous shoals, economic globalisation has never and will not veer off course, unquote.
In other words, have fun trying to stop them. They're all in it, and they ain't backing down, folks, okay? In fact, we were warned about this subterfuge a long time ago. See if this sounds familiar to today's issues.
A part of that plan, of course, is to induce the gradual surrender of American sovereignty, piece by piece and step by step, to various international organizations, of which the United Nations is the outstanding but far from the only example. Now, here are the aims for the United States. 1, greatly expanded government spending for every conceivable means of getting rid of ever larger sums of American money as wastefully as possible. 2, higher and then much higher taxes. 3, an increasingly unbalanced budget despite the higher taxes. 4, wild inflation of our currency. 5, government controls of prices, wages, and materials, supposedly to combat inflation. 6, greatly increased socialistic controls over every operation of our economy and every activity of our daily lives. This is to be accompanied naturally and automatically by a correspondingly huge increase in the size of our bureaucracy and in both the cost and reach of our domestic government. 7, far more centralization of power in Washington and the practical elimination of our state lines. There is a many-faceted drive at work to have our state lines eventually mean no more within the nation than our county lines do now within the states. 8, the steady advance of federal aid to and control over our educational system, leading to complete federalization of our public education. 9, a constant hammering into the American consciousness of the horror of modern warfare, the beauties and the absolute necessity of peace, peace always on communist terms, of course. And 10, the consequent willingness of the American people to allow the steps of appeasement by our government which amount to a piecemeal surrender of the rest of the free world and of the United States itself.
That was Robert Welch, American businessman and founder of the John Birch Society, warning about this communist takeover, now called the Great Reset, many decades ago. Too bad we didn't listen and take action back then. But as you can see, and our apathy or indifference, it's done nothing but help these sick global elite megalomaniacs advance their global agenda to take over the world and destroy the United States of America in the process, okay? And remember, they really have plans that no one is left behind in this planetary takeover of all of our livelihood.
I was refugee in Pakistan, I was refugee in Iran, I was refugee in Dubai, and now I'm a refugee in France.
Les gens, quand tu es handicapé, ils n'essaient même pas de voir ce que tu es capable de faire, mais ils te jugent à travers ton handicap.
Haberme vendido no fue una buena idea.
यहाँ की लड़कियां कुछ नहीं कर सकती।
लाइट रहित, उजियार रहित, हमरो बाल बचाव उजियार रहित.
Agama me fumidam bem, só bem مشكل نمي خالد.
Porque se todo mundo tivesse alimento em casa, ela podia raciocinar. Então, poderia ser pobre, mas teria inteligência na cabeça para poder sair dali.
Parce que na mukil mutu azwana mission na onzamba tindelai. Ngape na za mukil pona mission na ngai me nzamenda ebi.
I've left my husband to be with a woman, and for me that's a huge step in my country as an African woman to do that. I do have a strong voice and I'm strong as a woman speaking for myself.
Nous devons dire au monde que nous existons, que vous êtes là. Et je suis sûr qu'aucune misère, aucune pauvreté extrême n'est pas une fatalité. On peut la combattre.
Afaka ihany fa mba tsy hitovy amin'le hoe toerana nisy atsony zany fa mba lasa ambonimbony kokoa zany izy. Dia tamiko io ny reniny dia famihina teo zany any an-telo.
Yeah, for everybody to be a part of your global planetary takeover that the Bible warned about 2,000 years ago would become the Antichrist kingdom. But as you can see, in order to pull off this great reset, Agenda 21, 2030 Agenda, Fourth Industrial Revolution, whatever you want to call it, this globalist communist takeover of the planet, that's what it is, Klaus Schwab and the gang really do have plans to control not just all the world's leaders and the finances and the health, but all of our basic livelihoods around the whole planet as well. Okay? But unfortunately, as bad as that is, as invasive and communist as all that is, if you're paying attention, you saw they also have plans to control another important aspect of our individual livelihoods with this so-called Great Reset, and that is our individual finances. But don't worry, they say, you'll own nothing and be happy, as this guy warns is actually coming.
The Great Reset is an idea put forward by the World Economic Forum to fundamentally restructure the global economy in the wake of COVID-19. But what are some of the dangers inherent in this ideology? Joining me to discuss is Douglas Kruger, who's a speaker and author focusing on political correctness. Douglas, could you tell our viewers, what is this idea of the Great Reset exactly, and what are some of the risks attached to it?
Like many of the politically correct ideas that we hear bandied about in the media, this entire project is couched in in kindness. It is presented as something that is being done or being proposed for our good and for the greater good. And that always sets my alarms and sensors going, because that tends to lead to very problematic ideology. In a very quick nutshell, the proposal out of Davos is essentially this: a group of exceptionally powerful individuals, predominantly in the banking, finance, and business sector, in alliance with government leadership, are proposing that as a result of these COVID lockdowns that have done a great deal of damage to economies globally, they perceive that they now have an opportunity to rebuild economies, but to do so in what they believe is a more enlightened fashion. And there are, generally speaking, there are problems with the idea of groups of people in power deciding the history of humanity. In a best case scenario, we are simply supposed to be free to determine our own futures, our own progress, what we want out of life. Now, in this particular case, what they're proposing is a sort of collectivist idea that takes personal ownership out of the equation. The little phrase, and it sounds so innocent, is "you will own nothing and you will be happy." Now, if you go back just several hundred years, the founding father and first president of the United States, which was essentially a project founded on the idea of human liberty and freedom, pretty much for the first time in modern history, George Washington said, "There is no such thing as personal human rights without property ownership." And he said that for several very interesting and important reasons. But the principle is sound. If you are dependent on a greater power for everything, then you are not free. You place yourself as an individual in quite a precarious situation. It was, in fact, the formula for living, the sort of political reality for most of human history. If you look back at a simple setup like the serfs of Europe, this is a group of people who owned nothing and simply contributed to the overlord who determined what they could and could not have. And they had zero rights. It is the property that you own that actually ensures your rights to a great degree. So while this may sound like a very enlightened idea, sort of a communal, collectivist utopia, there are many problems with this once you start thinking about how it might actually be implemented. And that's what concerns me. Now, the sorts of things that we're hearing from Davos and from the likes of the proponents of the Great Reset all talk about collectivist and communal living and how nobody will own anything. But now consider for just a second, that is already a fallacy. Someone, somewhere, has to own. And in fact, what happens is, if you take ownership out of the hands of a broad-based populace and of many separate entrepreneurs and families and individuals, and you concentrate it into the hands of, say, a few multinational corporations working together with government, well, firstly, that system is by definition fascistic. This idea of an all-powerful government and the businesses that work in conjunction with them. It leads very quickly to cronyism, to the types of corruption that we see, particularly in South Africa, where we are so keen on talking about business and government collaborating. And doesn't that just sound like such a good thing, business and government collaborating? What happens there is you have the people who own the rules, enforce right and wrong, and have a financial incentive to be corrupt, working with the people who have the money and have an incentive to corrupt them. It's a dreadful formula just to begin with. However, what concerns me is perhaps on a bigger scale than that. When we talk about collective ownership, we are often told that the great thing about it is that everybody will own. The reality of the thing is that nobody but those in power own. And that impulse to take away private property ownership and to concentrate it into the hands of a representative government is purely Marxist. I mean, it is the heart and soul of the Marxist idea, which stripped down to its basics is nobody owns property, it is collectively owned. And as I say, of course, the fallacy there is that it is not actually collectively owned, it is owned by those in power. Now, what can go wrong with that? Well, if we look at modern day China, we get a very good example of this one. Modern day China, of course, a bit of a mixed economy. They have prospered to the degree that they've started permitting free trade. However, they are still very much a Marxist society. And they work according to social credit scores. And social credit scores imposed by law represent a very chilling idea. Now imagine this, for example. You as a family do not own your home. You do not own what is around you. You do not own your business. The government has absolute control because they are the representative of collective ownership. Now imagine a scenario in which you do something that the government does not approve of. You read a book that it doesn't want you to read. You write an essay or an article that it doesn't like. You create a YouTube video commenting on something in a negative way. Now, those are all things that productive human beings do to critique and build and grow their society. But you can't do it there. And if you do something that the government disapproves of, using these social credit scores, they can ghost you. They can effectively lock you out of your world. And it works because you don't own anything. It is that ownership, that broad-based private ownership, that keeps people free from government tyranny. It sounds like terrible fear-mongering, but of course the question for anyone who looks back over history is to ask, could it happen here? Could it happen again? And I think if you do know your history, the answer is it happens surprisingly easily and it happens surprisingly often. When communities play with this idea of collectivist ownership, I would argue that it happens 100% of the time. And that when we're talking about collective ownership and the elevating of the group over the sanctity of the individual, we are dealing with a formula that has been deeply damaging to the human species.
So Douglas, what about the threats to the property that we already own? Is there a risk there that we might lose our ownership over our existing property?
David, that's an excellent question, and it's one that I think people are not considering. Now, think again of those words. You will own nothing, and you will be happy. It doesn't allow for you will continue to own what your family has bequeathed down the generations. The simple statement, if we are to take them at their word, is you will own nothing, and you will be happy. Now, that poses some fascinating problems in terms of what communities already own. We largely around the world, we own our homes. We bequeath heirlooms, family heirlooms to the next generation. You might own a wedding ring. You might own things that you want to give on to your children. And I would argue that that is one of the very best things that we do. Each generation tries to uplift the next generation. This philosophy seems to be saying, instead of doing that, we reset each generation at zero and leave you dependent on a government welfare system. We're proposing it on a global scale.
Doesn't sound like we'll be happy after that. It's not we'll own nothing and be happy. It's they'll own everything and they'll be happy. What a farce. There is no good in this, folks. But how are they going to pull it off? I mean, this farce, this so-called Great Reset. Well, again, not only by controlling all our world leaders and all the world finances and all the world's health and all our basic livelihoods, but even all of our individual finances. And if you've been paying attention, this is one of the most biggest and important leverages of this whole Great Reset takeover of the planet. You will not only take away people's individual properties, but also their individual finances, so they'll be reduced to slavery and be forced to do whatever you tell them to do or not to do. And believe it or not, folks, this is the next plan from Klaus Schwab and his evil gang of global elites. Okay? It's what I call the nail in the coffin. It's literally controlling all of our individual livelihoods by controlling all of our individual finances, which, as you'll see, is yet another aspect of the coming evil satanic antichrist kingdom that God warned about nearly 2,000 years ago. You see, the Bible clearly warned us that in the last days we would see the whole world corralled into not only a one-world government, but a one-world economy with a cashless society that would biometrically and universally be tied to everyone on the whole planet at that time with a marking system that's called the Mark of the Beast. And it's going to allow the Antichrist to control all the buying and selling on the whole planet. Okay, so before we show you how this actual micromanaged financial system of the Antichrist that God's been warning us about for nearly 2,000 years would come, and is actually being built before our very eyes by Klaus Schwab, the World Economic Forum, and his evil gang of global elites, let's remind ourselves of that biblical warning from God. It's Revelation 13:11 through 18. It says this, "Then I saw another beast coming out of the earth, and he had 2 horns like a lamb, but he spoke like a dragon. He exercised all authority of the first beast, the Antichrist, on his behalf, and he made the earth and its inhabitants worship the first beast whose fatal wound had been healed. And he performed great and miraculous signs, even causing fire to come down to heaven heaven into earth in full view of men. And because of these signs he was given power to do on behalf of the first beast, he deceived the inhabitants of the earth. And he ordered them to set up an image in honor of the beast who was wounded by the sword and yet lived. And he was given power to give breath to the image of the first beast so that it could speak and cause all who refused to worship the image to be killed. And watch this. He also forced everyone, small and great, rich and poor, free and slave, to receive a mark on his right hand or his forehead. Why? So that no one could buy or sell unless he had the mark, which is the name of the beast or the number of his name. This calls for wisdom. If anyone has insight, let him calculate the number of the beast, for it is man's number. His number is 666. And so here we see the Bible also warned about a coming day when all the inhabitants of the earth will be under the universal economy or monetary system of the Antichrist himself. And he will literally be controlling all the buying and the selling. And whether you realize it or not, folks, that individual control of people's buying and selling around the whole planet, it's already happening right now before our very eyes via the deceptive COVID plandemic and the Great Reset farce. Okay? They're using those lies to create this one world universal economy that the Bible warned about in 3 different ways. Okay? And the first way that they've already laid the groundwork for the one world economy of the Great Reset, okay, is by having the machinery already in place. Okay? You see, right now there's already in place the plans for absolute total economic control of the whole planet. Okay, whether we understand it or not, folks, for the first time in man's history, our economies are already, not coming, they're already connected globally. And let me give you a case in point. Right now there's already what's called a universal bank. It's actually called the World Bank, shocker, which is the world's leading lending money to the nations around the planet. But wait a second. If you're going to have a universal bank, then you need a universal lending institution to oversee the dispersion of all these loans, right? Well, hello, what do you think is the function of what's called the International Monetary Fund? It oversees the whole world's financial system and even fixes the exchange rates. But wait a second. If you're going to have a universal lending institution, then you need to have a universal money exchanger to funnel all this money to all the different countries, right? Well, guess what? There's a universal electronic banking system. It's called SWIFT, SWIFT, which automatically makes sure that all the different money transactions in the world match all the different currencies. Well, wait a second. If you're going to have a universal money exchanger, okay, then you need to have some sort of a universal strong arm, to punish those who don't obey this world banking system, right? Well, guess what? Folks, right now, for many, many years, there's what's called the World Trade Organization. What do you think that is? They not only set the trading rules for the world, but they punish all countries who do not obey their rules with billion-dollar fines, even here in the U.S. And so as you can see, folks, the machinery for a one-world global economy or a great economic reset, it's already here. It's not 50 years down the road. It's already here now. Now, for further proof of this is why we have all these global treaties that we keep hearing about all the time, nonstop. But what people don't realize is they're all about tying together the world's economies. Case in point, first there was the GATT Treaty in 1944, which stands for the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade. And that helped to, quote, liberalize world trade. Then 50 years later, in 1994, we had the NAFTA, or the North American Free Trade Agreement. Okay? And then 10 years after that, in 2004, we had CAFTA, or the Central American Free Trade Agreement, combining Central American countries. And then the very next year, in 2005, we had the FTAA, or the Free Trade Agreement of the Americas, which proposed to encompass the whole Western Hemisphere and their economies. And this is happening all over the world right now in great fashion. There's what's called the AFTA Treaty, okay, the ASEAN Free Trade Treaty, or the APTA, Asian Pacific Trade Agreement, the SICA, the Central American Integration System, or CASE or whatever. There's other proposed ones like CEFTA, the Central European Free Trade Agreement. There's COMESA, the Common Market for the Eastern and Southern Africa. There's GAFTA, the Greater Arab, believe it or not, they're in on this, Free Trade Area. There's SAFTA, the South Asia Free Trade Agreement. Even TAFTA, the Transatlantic Free Trade, and on and on and on it goes. And there's another one out there that we've heard for the last few years. It's called TPP. Okay, this trade agreement. It's called the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which President Trump pulled out of and Obama and Clinton were going headlong into. But it encompasses 12 nations in the Pacific area, including Australia, Brunei, Canada, Chile, Japan, Malaysia, Mexico, New Zealand, Peru, Singapore, Vietnam, and of course the United States. But here's my point. As you can see, these global trade agreements, they're needed to create a truly intertwined global economy for the great economic reset that's going to create these 10 global economic regions that we talked about earlier in Revelation 17 that the Bible says will then be handed over to the actual Antichrist. Okay, so the machinery is already here. The second way that they've already laid the groundwork for the one world economy of the Great Reset is by having the mindset is already in place. Not just the machinery, but the mindset. And you see, Klaus Schwab and the game, they've slowly but surely been warming you and I up like a frog in a pot, to use that analogy, over the years to this crazy idea that, quote, we'll own nothing and be happy, which includes where we get to live, how we get to live, who we can marry, how many kids we can have, what education we can get, and on and on and on it goes. These elites will literally control everything, and no, we won't be happy. But they've brainwashed tons of people on the planet to go along with this lie under the guise that we must let them, the elites, do this to us and bring us into this, frankly, global tyranny. In order to what? To save the planet, to keep it from blowing up, which, Lord willing, will expose that lie, a huge big lie, from these sick megalomaniacs in our next documentary, Lord willing. But this brainwashing mindset, it's already being produced by people to go along with their total control of our individual finances, okay? And it's with something that they have out there. They say what we need is a universal basic income. And believe it or not, if you've been paying attention, it's advocated by all the time, folks, by these same global elites, including the likes of Elon Musk, Mark Zuckerberg, Bill Gates, just to name a few, who, by the way, again, all work for the same agenda as Klaus Schwab and the World Economic Forum. But they all say that the governments around the world need to give every citizen a guaranteed income. And this universal basic income may be the only solution, they say, to save us and the planet and enable us to recover from this COVID pandemic and blah, blah, blah. But for those of you who haven't heard of this economic mindset, here's a basic rundown of this thing that they're pitching called a universal basic income.
Universal basic income is pretty much what the name suggests, an income for everyone in the form of a cash transfer, no strings attached. Finland is among a handful of countries experimenting with universal basic income as a way to address unemployment in the country. A key feature of the universal basic income is that you can spend the money however you like. The idea of handing out cash to every citizen isn't new. Philosopher Thomas Paine proposed the idea of payments to every person all the way back in 1797. Martin Luther King Jr. fought for a guaranteed income in the 1960s, and even free market champion Milton Friedman endorsed the negative income tax, similar to basic income, as a way to reduce welfare costs and bureaucracy. But lately, tech titans in Silicon Valley, like Elon Musk and Mark Zuckerberg, are some of the biggest advocates of the idea. Other advocates say a basic income would alleviate poverty and help address growing income inequality across the developed world. The idea has support across the political spectrum, from libertarians who say it would simplify the existing social welfare state, to socialists who want to redistribute wealth toward the lower and middle class. Finland isn't the only country experimenting with universal basic income. Other trials are underway in the Netherlands, Kenya, Canada, and the United States.
Oh, so it's gaining popularity everywhere, okay? And this is what they've been using the COVID pandemic as an excuse for, to bring in, quote, a universal basic income as a policy response to what? To COVID-19. And this article says this: universal basic income is the answer to the inequalities exposed by what? COVID-19, okay? And watch this from Forbes, quote, an unexpected outcome of the COVID-19 pandemic, a slew of universal income programs. Really? Was that really unexpected? Or has it been a part of the plan the whole time? Hello, okay? But the article goes on to say, and I quote, the COVID-19 pandemic came into American lives like a wrecking ball, disrupting everything from income and employment to childcare to education. But then help arrived. Through multiple congressional acts, the Americans received direct, no strings attached stimulus payments. Remember those? With more Americans than ever feeling the benefits of these recent no strings attached direct income payments, it's unsurprising that many polls find that a majority of Americans now support some sort of universal basic income, or UBI. And UBI was already in motion in the U.S., established in 1983 by Alaska's Permanent Dividend Fund that sends annual payments, typically between $1,000 to $2,000, to more than 600,000 Alaskan residents. And they still do it to this day, by the way. In fact, several cities across the country have UBI-type programs slated to start or are already in progress. Listen to this. California has the Compton Pledge that serves the residents of the city of Compton with unconditional monthly payments. It also has Big Leap, which transfers payments to low-income residents in the city of LA. Then there's Colorado. They have what's called the Denver Basic Income Project. And then Florida has the Income Gainesville. Georgia has In Her Hands, benefiting Georgia women. It's one of the largest cash transfer pilot programs in the whole South. Illinois has the Chicago Resilient Communities Pilot, which is one of the nation's largest cash transfer programs. And according to Mayor Lori Lightfoot, the program seeks to, quote, tackle poverty and put residents at the center of the economic recovery from, here it is, the COVID-19 pandemic. And Louisiana, they have what's called the Shreveport Guaranteed Income Program. New Jersey has the Newark Movement for Economic Equality. And New York has, of course, it's called the Bridge Project. But you might be thinking, well, okay, so come on. Maybe that's those places, but there's no way the rest of America is going to go along with all this, right? I mean, we're too patriotic, right? We're too individualized. I mean, it's the American dream to take care of yourself and be independent of the government, right? Psst, not anymore. Look around. Not only has socialism, the new relabeled term for communism, been on the rise thanks to the brainwashing of the secular school system, but they've also produced that mindset in a whole new generation of younger people who are likewise not patriotic. And what do? They cry out for the government to pay for everything. You know, we call it the you owe me, or the, quote, entitlement mentality that we see rampant everywhere in younger generations. They've been brainwashed. In fact, some admit the COVID plandemic was also used to produce this mindset for a universal basic income into the rest of us non-socialists, non-communists. Watch this.
Today I want to share with you something that Congress is proposing because there's a few ideas out on the floor that look and sound very similar to a concept called UBI. And if you're not familiar with what that is, it stands for Universal Basic Income. Now, the CARES Act has given people a one-time cash payment of up to $1,200. Can you imagine what Andrew Yang must be feeling like right now? Freedom dividends. But a lot of people are still waiting for their stimulus checks, with most agreeing that it's simply not enough money to keep their life going. So in order to continue stimulating, Congress will be voting today once more on another bill that proposes an additional $300 billion for the Paycheck Protection Program. So it looks like this one will be passed, and the idea of UBI, or Universal Basic Income, is not that far-fetched. In fact, right now, there's a few plans to add to a potentially Phase 4 of the stimulus package plan, and one of them involves forgiving all rent and mortgage payments. Yeah, don't even worry about paying your mortgage or your rent. We got this. The whole stimulus narrative is bringing us closer and closer to what seems like the inevitable solution, where every American is going to be entitled to a basic standard form of income, regardless of whether or not they have a job. Believe it or not, the Pope himself, Pope Francis, has even called for universal basic income.
Oh, just in time to introduce the Antichrist himself, Mr. False Prophet wannabe. But as you can see, there's way more going on with this COVID pandemic than what we first thought, okay? Even here in the U.S., okay? Again, it's the old adage, folks, if you create a crisis, you can manage the outcome. And that outcome is leading us all, the whole planet, to accept a universal basic income that they need to control our individual finances and pull off their great economic reset, okay? The third way that they've already got the groundwork laid for the one world economy of this great reset is they also already have the mechanism already in place, okay? And once again, let's go back to our text and let's pull out another thing that Klaus Schwab and the gang are doing for the Antichrist with this COVID pandemic as the excuse. And that's, again, this passage, Revelation 13, 16 through 17. He also forced everyone, small and great, rich and poor, free and slave, to receive a mark on his right hand or his forehead. Why? So that no one could buy or sell unless he had the mark, which is the name of the beast or the number of his name. Okay? So think about this in light of that passage of Scripture, and I think it's common sense. Okay? If you're the Antichrist and the false prophet, and you're going to pull off this one world economy system, this mark of the beast system, then you're not only going to have to be able to create the machinery to combine all the world's economies into one system, and you not only have to have created the mindset for all the world's population to be duped to go along with it all, okay? But you've got to have, and you've got to create the mechanism that will combine all the world's products into one giant global matrix system in order to control all the buying and selling, including a universal currency that everybody could use, right? It's common sense. And so this tells us that at some point they're going to have to get us to switch from some sort of to an electronic or a cashless society, because the Antichrist controls all the buying and selling with a mark on the right hand or on the forehead, okay? And so again, this tells us it has to be some form of a electronic payment system. And that's common sense, because you don't tape a dollar bill to your hand to make a payment, in this passage in Revelation. That's not the mark. You don't slap $20 to your forehead to pay for groceries. I mean, that's ridiculous. So obviously on the context there, it tells us you've got to have some sort of electronic capability to make a financial transaction with this mark of the beast system, and specifically, it's got to be connected to your right hand and your forehead. Well, again, I said all that to make this point. Believe it or not, that too is being pushed with this great reset from Klaus Schwab and his evil gang of global elites, and this COVID pandemic is the excuse to do it. Okay, in fact, once again, they've warmed us up to their ultimate satanic goal over the years, like again, a frog in the pot. If you've been paying attention, folks, for the first time in man's history, you've already gone, listen, here's how it all happened, slowly but surely. We've gone from paper currency to electronic cash, and it's happening very fast, okay? So let's trace the trail. For instance, if we didn't have, back in the day, we didn't have any money on us, the first step was, hey, don't worry, just write a check, right? And then if we didn't have the money to write a check, then they came out with this thing, it's called, hey, don't worry, just charge it to a credit card, okay? But if we didn't want to pay the interest on that credit card, then, hey, don't worry, we'll just take it out of your checking account with a debit card. And then not long after that, debit card spending over to cash spending, which led to all these features being combined into one card, which is basically we all have now. They're called smart cards. And a smart card is a card about the size of, normal regular credit card. But this one, the difference is it's got a tiny microchip in it that can store and receive information and make financial transactions as well. Okay, and then all these convenient payment features were transferred to another microchip device that everybody just has to have on the planet, and does basically, and they carry it around in their hands, and that's the cell phone. And now people use the cell phone in their hand to buy stuff. In fact, so much so has this step been working step by step, conditioning us. It's worked brilliantly. Even here in the United States, we are now basically already a cashless society.
When Brianne Kimmel gets ready to go in the morning, cash is not in the equation.
I think the last time I went to an ATM was 2 years ago.
She streamlined her wallet to credit cards only. Cash, she feels, is inconvenient and dangerous.
There's a lot of times where I think if I had a lot of cash on me, I'd be a little bit anxious.
Between 2000 and 2015, non-cash payments in the U.S. grew by almost 400%.
$338 for you. Okay. I haven't really needed cash, to be honest. It's either my credit card or if I'm out with friends, I'll use Venmo.
Venmo, the mobile app where people can pay each other on a smartphone, now processes $2 billion a month. This year, Apple added similar payment capabilities in iMessage. These free services are so popular, 30 major banks recently launched a competing product called Zelle. Doing away with paper money has been a big boom for small businesses, too.
Chicken part. Washington's family-run Italian chain Bazzelli's has been in business for 5 decades. But at their newly opened downtown location, they've taken a radical step to remain competitive. No more cash. If you want to buy your lunch here, you'll have to pay with plastic.